Hello everyone, welcome back to Exploder. We are here again with another episode just for you. After a slight diversion into Roller Jam last week, if you ever have a chance, listen to that. It's like wrestling, but not quite. I'm back to professional wrestling as it should be. Today we're going to talk about an icon of professional wrestling, the history of The Undertaker. If you're a fan of professional wrestling, which if you're on here, I hope you are, you know the history of The Undertaker. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the backstory, from the Master of Pain to Mean Mark Callis, Remember the Skyscrapers, none of that stuff. I'm not going to waste time, and I'm not going to waste your time or mine. So, yes, he had a heck of a career, a little bit of a career, before debuting at Survivor Series 1990 for the WWF as The Undertaker. Originally called Kane the Undertaker, but was really just shortened to The Undertaker immediately. So that's kind of where Kane come from. That's a nice little piece of trivia. But he's debuted, was put in a main event spot right away, but with Ric Flair. He was Ric Flair's mystery partner in the Survivor Series that year. It is immediately put in with Hogan. He wins the belt from Hogan and then immediately drops it back to him on this Tuesday in Texas, a Tuesday pay-per-view attempted by WWE at a time where pay-per-views were honestly on Mondays and whatever, but it just didn't work. The Undertaker was he's known now as an icon, and that's really cool. It's cool to see an icon, a character that just lasts generation after generation, from the waning days of Hulkamania to the new generation to the Attitude Era and well into, the Ruthless Aggression Era, and now being sort of I don't want to say sideshow, but as an attraction in the modern era, this new era as we call it. So for someone to have that kind of longevity, that's pretty cool. But I want to talk about The Undertaker from 1994 through, we'll get to the end point. In 1994, by 1993-94, The Undertaker he was an attraction, and that's what made him a really great character. The problem with it was you had to create these large-than-life characters to face him. So in a lot of ways, he was almost like a version of Hogan. Hogan always had the big monster he had to face. The Undertaker was already a big monster. He's 6'10". He's a big guy. So you always had to have somebody bigger, or at least appeared bigger than him, to go against. And that included guys like Yokozuna, who was much larger, guys like Mabel, who was certainly a lot heavier. You had Giant Gonzalez, that disastrous match at WrestleMania 9, where Giant Gonzalez sleptwalked his way through the ring, and The Undertaker did his best to try and make it tolerable. He had matches with Kamu Mustafa, who's a really good friend of his, Charles Wright, the Godfather, what have you. Matches against King Kong Bundy that were slow and plotting, because that's what King Kong Bundy is. And he would have really good matches with Bret Hart. And he was a utility player in that they would bring him in when they needed him. If they needed him in the main event spot with with Bret Hart or even Diesel, you could. But there was also the guy that if you had Bret Hart versus Diesel, you could pull The Undertaker back and put him in that role with the big, clunky, giant guys and use him properly. So it was one of those guys where he was a utility player, but he's also known, he was a guy that would work some of the most god-awful people, and he did it on a consistent basis. That's what made him so good. He was talented and good at that. He was a guy you could put in the ring with really anybody. I mean, they put him in with Jake Roberts, who couldn't have a match with Jake Roberts, but Jimmy Snuka. And then by the 90s, he was just, they ran Kamala for another run, and they put him with The Undertaker. They put all these guys who, some of them were absolute garbage. I mean, Giant Gonzalez was the gimmick. He was a look. He was a bunch of airbrushed body parts, but muscles and strategically placed hair, and he had a WrestleMania match with that guy, and they'd put him with this guy, and it wasn't great, but The Undertaker did his best. He had an angle with Kamu Mustafa where Kamu Mustafa melted down the urn, and he supposedly made it into a chain that basically there was a lot more gold supposedly on that chain than ever could have been in that urn, which made it even funnier, in which they replaced with a bigger urn. Then of course there was 1994, the infamous Undertaker versus Undertaker, which if you classically look at that, it was done very well. He disappears after the Royal Rumble 1984, which is my first pay-per-view, by the way, where it took 13 guys, Yokozuna in a Sherman tank, to destroy the Undertaker, put him in the casket, and he disappeared. He wasn't there at WrestleMania that year. That was WrestleMania 10. He wasn't there, and so the whole time he's spinning out. I think he's sitting out an injury. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure he's sitting out an injury. And they go to SummerSlam, and the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, which was sort of on the tail end of his influence as a manager, though he still was, for the time, still pretty influential, comes out and says he's purchased the services of The Undertaker for his $1 million corporation, and I assure you in a future episode, I will get to that stable. Oh my God. Anyway, so he says he got the Undertaker, and he brings out an Undertaker. Now, at first glance, you see a guy with the long hair, around the same size, with the jacket. All right, viable. Now, of course, it was Brian Lee, who would be Bulldozer Brian Lee, Primetime Brian Lee. He would then come back as Chains, and then he'd work in TNA when it first started out, when they were just using pretty much anybody who would take a booking. But yeah, Brian Lee was a very good friend of the Undertaker at the time, and so they brought him in. The problem was, and the tattoos were even similar. The biggest problem was, thankfully, the Undertaker at the time didn't have his full arm tattoos, and he didn't have his chest piece and his shoulder, his neck, and all that stuff. So it'd been a little harder to match that. But this time, the problem was Brian Lee's not as tall as the Undertaker. He's close, but he's not quite. So when you put them face to face, nose to nose, there was a distinct difference. And they made a point of making a difference where he always looked like a knockoff. He was using the gray, and this is when the Undertaker debuted with the purple gloves, purple boot covers, things like that. And the match was not good. And the thing was, it's a shame because it was a great build-up. It was built up perfectly. It was built up as in a great angle. It was built up the way it was done. Although it was the WWF in 1994, and it was awful, the angle itself, in its own little microcosm, was really well done. The execution was good for what it was. It's just the match didn't pay off, and they had one match, and the real Undertaker won, and that was the end of it. Going into, then he had the King Kong Bundy match at WrestleMania. He was going back into the monsters, and then he had some really great series with both Diesel and Bret Hart, and those are really cool, and those are really amazing matches. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a huge Bret Hart fan. I get that he's proficient in the ring. I'm sure if someone's in the ring with him, and they say, hey, he's a really good wrestler, I'm not going to disavow that. I'm not going to pretend like I know more about what's going on in the ring than someone who's actually been in the ring. So if Shawn Michaels or Kevin Nash or anybody who says, well, yeah, Bret Hart was really good in the ring, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not saying he wasn't. I don't know. I've never been in the ring with him. But as a character, just as someone to watch, I've always found Bret Hart a little boring. Like, I'm sure he's proficient, but there's a lot of guys in the ring who are proficient. I mean, Brad Armstrong was proficient, but he had the personality of a stale fish, and he just wasn't entertaining. Now, on the tail end of that, as a little aside here, you look at Road Dogg, who's his brother, who will be the first to tell you his technical skill's not the greatest, but he has a personality that makes you interested in what he's doing, what he's saying. I always saw Bret Hart as a guy who was really good in the ring, proficient, and people like to work with him. But as a character and as a match, I've watched a Bret Hart match outside of a couple off the top of my head. I always thought he was a little boring. But he had a good Bret Hart match with The Undertaker, and The Undertaker would have matches with him, and then he'd have matches with Kevin Nash as Diesel, and he was always a good guy. So he's always really good for that position. Again, you could pull him back, but you had him where he needed to be. Another point, then in 97, they finally, which I hadn't realized this at the time, I don't know if this is on purpose or not, but they finally put The Undertaker against Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels, of course, was part of DX and was sort of slowly turning into this hardcore heel type character. And The Undertaker and him, up to that point, as far as people knew, and I this could be legit, I don't know, outside of house shows and things like that, but as far as televised or pay-per-view, they had never had a singles match. So at the, in retrospect, horribly named pay-per-view Ground Zero, 1987, one of the last In Your House events, one of the last, 6 months of the In Your House series, Ground Zero, Shawn Michaels and The Undertaker faced off one-on-one. And this was, of course, after SummerSlam 97, where Shawn Michaels was a referee. He swung the chair to hit Bret Hart. Bret Hart ducks. He hits The Undertaker, and Shawn Michaels reluctantly counts the pin for Bret Hart to pin The Undertaker to become world champion. So I thought that was done really well. The first match was Ground Zero, which was in September. Their second match is the most famous of them. Maybe the most famous. I mean, I think later ones were more famous, but the most famous of that time was at Bad Blood in October. They had the first Hell in a Cell, which saw the inclusion of Kane, and there were so many layers in that, which was really cool. The Undertaker then leaves that, and Shawn, of course, goes to Bret Hart, Montreal, and that's a whole different episode. Oh dear God. And The Undertaker immediately goes into the angle with Kane, which again, another one was very well done. They didn't immediately go to, okay, he runs in October, they have a match in November, and they blow it off by Royal Rumble. They built up to WrestleMania, and they built this, and it was that first time you saw The Undertaker, literally the first time I think you ever saw The Undertaker where he was vulnerable. You saw a human side to him. He wasn't this impenetrable, unbeatable, unstoppable guy. It was a guy who saw what was ostensibly his brother, as far as the angle goes, and he says, I won't fight you. I won't. And so you saw this human side to him which was really cool. It was different, and it sort of added this dimension to him. And of course, they go to WrestleMania. He beats Kane, which is cool because no one had really beat Kane up to that point. He'd been protected in that way. And this is The Undertaker as it was in 1998. Wow, that was bad. I'm doing a podcast here and I'm blanking on years. So 1998 comes around. Of course, then in June 1998, he has another Hell in a Cell with Mankind, where he chucks him for distance like it's an Olympic sport, and then chokeslams him through the cage, this time on accident. And then then things start changing around late 98. This is where I think there's a debate. And when late 98 comes out, The Undertaker starts going, he reconciles with Paul Bearer, who had betrayed him in SummerSlam 96 against Mankind, and it had this really on and off relationship with him since. He reconciles with him and starts the Ministry of Darkness. And the Ministry of Darkness was like really, really far. I mean, for the Attitude Era, it was at one point, it was like this really, it fit in the Attitude Era, but at the same time, it became like this, it was almost this sideshow. It was almost this attraction outside of the Attitude Era, because at the same time, while you had Stone Cold Steve Austin beating up his boss, and you had The Rock, and you had all these real life characters, you had The Undertaker over here doing satanic rituals and hanging people on his symbol, aka cross. This was the point where he was sacrificing people. He sacrificed Midian. Like, he supposedly cut him and made him drink blood on Raw in the middle of it all. And that was like the weirdest thing. Like, that was the Ministry of Darkness. And it was really dark and it was really satanic, and he was wearing a robe, and then of course that led to the Higher Power storyline, and that was just the most god-awful thing I ever saw in my life. I'm pretty sure that's a war crime. But it was really, to me, that was as far as the character could go as it was. That was the end result of The Undertaker. At that point, where do you go? In late 1999, The Undertaker's got an injury. He leaves. Now, he does a promo and he basically quits. He leaves. He comes back in Judgment Day in, I believe, it's right after WrestleMania, so I believe it was May. I'm pretty sure it was May of 2000. He comes back. This time, he's wearing a full-length trench coat, bandana. He's coming out to Kid Rock. We're not all perfect. And coming out to American Badass by Kid Rock, because he had an album out, and it was 2000, and literally at that point, even people connected to Kid Rock were famous. I'm looking at you, Uncle Cracker. And he comes to the ring and he interferes in the match and causes a title change, and then he becomes like this badass biker. Now, he's this badass biker, the American Badass, from 2000, from like May of 2000 until 2004, till WrestleMania 20, which is 2004. So for about roughly 4 years, he's this biker character. And people say, I've never seen a character. There's all these images of The Undertaker, and you could see in your head there's these images of what The Undertaker is. And The Undertaker, in a lot of people's minds, is that classical Undertaker, or maybe the Ministry of Darkness, or even now, maybe the modern era, where he's sort of what he is now, and it's sort of this look, and it changes a little bit every year, but his hair's gone, his hair is back, he's got a mohawk, he's bald, his hair is back, things like that. But to me, like, people have this like aversion. Most people have this big aversion to the American Badass. And I don't understand it, because to me, I think the American Badass character, honestly, was the natural progression of the character. It was the point where, because once they got the Ministry of Darkness, he's sacrificing people. He's having black weddings with Stephanie McMahon. He's cutting himself and making people drink his blood. He has a group of people. He's throwing fireballs, this lightning and all this stuff, this really hocus pocus, big time stuff. Where do you go from there? Once you get to the end of I wouldn't have done the Higher Power, obviously. I don't think anyone would have in hindsight. But up to that point, where do you go after that? Where do you go after you do the most satanic, most ritualistic, most demonic stuff? What do you do after that? I mean, where's there to go? Do you go back to wearing a cowboy hat with a teardrop, quote unquote, tattoo on your face? Do you go back to, you can't go back. So to me, it was a detour, but I thought it was a natural progression. You have to do something different. And for a couple years, that's what he was. And then honestly, and I know this is an unpopular opinion, I don't think he's been different. I don't think he's been better since. I think the American Badass was different from the Ministry of Darkness, which was different from, the classical Undertaker that we all know and love. But I think that when he came back in 2004, I think since then, although he's had some great matches and some great angles, honestly, since he came back in 2004 to face Kane again, I think it's just been a nostalgia tour. And I'm not saying he hasn't had good matches, and I'm not saying he hasn't been entertaining, and he's introduced, the Hell's Gate, the Gogoplata submission, and things like that, and his promo styles sort of become a mixture of, you know, the old Undertaker, the more mystic Undertaker, and the badass, realistic type. But at the same time, I think it's been a nostalgia tour, because when he came back in 04, what did he do? He put on the cowboy hat, he wore the suspenders, like the singlet, I guess, with the pants, and it was like a mixture of those styles, but he was still the Undertaker, and he was still, you know, he possessed a guy. He possessed Josh Matthews. That's what it was. And honestly, hearing Josh Matthews on commentary, he probably should have stayed that way. And they started this stuff, but it was really just it was a rehash of everything he was doing before. So to me, now it's a yearly thing. He shows up once a year. I mean, this past year he did what, a 2-minute match with John Cena, which, understanding he can't do more. I mean, in his age, which to me he says, why don't you just retire? But again, I'm not in his shoes, so I'm not going to tell a guy what to do with his own career. But to me, people talk about this American Badass character as such a terrible, terrible thing. I don't think it was. I think it was a diversion. It was different. It was a different character, but I don't think it was bad. I just think it was different. And to me, I thought once you got to the point where you're physically sacrificing people and wearing cloaks and have basically your own cult, you're hanging people and all these things. Once you get to that point, there is nowhere else for that to go, and you had to change it. They had to change it. If nothing else, for those 4 years where he was off, he could be something different. And then, so when he did come back with the hat, and when he did come back as, you know, the Undertaker, it meant something. Because if he went from Ministry of Darkness just to what he was in 04, that'd be a huge shift, but it wouldn't mean anything. They'd be like, oh, now he's wearing a hat now. It's just different. So to me, like, the American Badass was sort of an interlude, and it needed to be in there. And I think for what it was good. You know, some people say it turned him into everyone else, but honestly, I think, in all honesty, his Ministry of Darkness stuff, like I said, sort of was its own thing. It was sort of this, you had all this realism. You had Degeneration X and The Nation and Steve Austin and The Rock and Mick Foley and all this stuff. And then you had like this little sideshow where there was magic and cults and bloodletting. It was sort of this like little sideshow, and some people say that's good. To me, that was like, okay, here's the realism, and by the way, this guy's still shooting lightning. Like, that's, to me, that's sort of off-putting. I mean, it worked, clearly. The Attitude Era was still the most successful era in all of wrestling, but to me, like, it didn't fit as much. To me, the American Badass character fit more. And all of that. But despite everything he did, he still had a great career. He still has this great career because he's still going. I mean, he had supposedly his last match years. I mean, how many times every year at WrestleMania are you talking about The Undertaker's last match? This could be his last match. I mean, heck, last year, he left his hat and jacket in the ring, and people are like, oh, that's it. He comes back this year for a 2-minute match because he couldn't do more. And again, thank him for a great career. Thank him for a great career. And I don't want to take that away from him. But to me, it's like, at what point do you rest on what you have and what you made? And at what point do you become that guy who's still trying to go and still trying to make something? At what point do you become Billy Graham with a karate outfit? How soon? How eventually you become that guy who's just desperately hanging on? And how, at one point, do you start diminishing your legacy, as great as that legacy is? And I think he has to evaluate that. But I don't want to end on a negative note. I love The Undertaker. I think he's a great talent. Iconic is not even the beginning of the word. He's respected by everybody in the business, everybody out of the business, reporters, bookers. I mean, you find one guy who's universally respected like that, it's hard to find him. So I just wanted to do this episode about The Undertaker. I don't know, I might do these in the future. I don't know. Tell me what you think. If you have a comment or an idea for this, tell me what you think. If you thought this was a good idea to sort of go over a particular character, a particular gimmick or something, and just run with it for as long as I can, or if you think this was just a long, boring episode, tell me. Put it down in the comments. Send me a message. You know, letterbomb my house. I don't care. Do what you got to do. That's between you and the FBI. Do what you got to do. Let me know what you think. And yeah, so until next time, I'm Dan. This is Exploder. Have a good one.